Felicia stands in the doorway of the executive suite, watching federal agents box up servers while her company's founder, Jackson, sits ashen-faced as an agent reads him his rights. Just hours earlier, he had belittled her in front of the entire company. "Sweetheart, stick to the paperwork. Let the men handle business." After 8 years of documenting violations and being ignored, that comment was the final straw. As Jackson's eyes meet hers across the room, she gives him a small, knowing smile. The reckoning has finally come. I graduated top of my class from Columbia Law School, with a specialization in financial compliance and regulatory law. My professors called me meticulous, thorough, and uncompromising. Those qualities earned me a prestigious job offer from Tech Dynamics, a fintech startup that was disrupting traditional banking with innovative payment processing solutions. Their promise was simple: make money transfers as easy as sending a text message. The day I walked into their downtown Manhattan office, I was filled with optimism. The space hummed with energy-exposed brick walls covered with motivational quotes, developers huddled around screens, and the constant ping of new transaction alerts from the massive dashboard displayed on the main floor. This wasn't just a job. It was a chance to shape an industry from the ground up. Jackson Mercer, the founder and CEO, greeted me personally. With his perfectly tailored suit, bright blue eyes, and firm handshake, he exuded the charisma that had made him a darling of the tech press. "Felicia, welcome to the revolution," he said, leading me through the office. "Most companies bring in compliance people to check boxes. We brought you in to build something that works for the future of finance, not the past." I still remember how those words made me feel valued. Special. Like I wasn't just a necessary corporate function, but an integral part of the vision. Jackson introduced me to the leadership team. Aaron Wells, the Chief Technology Officer, a coding prodigy who looked perpetually sleep-deprived. Stephanie Harper, the Chief Operating Officer, the only other woman in senior leadership who gave me an encouraging smile. And Daniel Brooks, the Chief Financial Officer, who barely looked up from his spreadsheet during our introduction. "We're moving fast here," Jackson explained, as he showed me to my office, surprisingly spacious for a startup. "Our motto is, move fast and solve real problems. Sometimes that means asking forgiveness rather than permission, but that's where you come in. Keep us innovative but legal." I spent my first week reviewing their systems, policies, and transaction flows. Tech Dynamics processed millions of dollars daily through their platform, connecting businesses, individuals, and financial institutions. The technology was impressive, but my trained eye quickly spotted concerning patterns. By Friday, I had compiled my first compliance assessment. Several transaction patterns bypassed standard anti-money laundering checks. Customer verification was inconsistent, and their cross-border payment system operated in a regulatory gray area in at least 3 countries. I scheduled a meeting with the executive team, prepared with clear findings and actionable recommendations. This was my chance to demonstrate my value and set the company on the right path. The conference room fell silent as I finished my presentation. I looked at their faces. Jackson's smile had faded. Aaron was typing furiously on his laptop. Stephanie looked concerned, and Daniel was shaking his head. Jackson broke the silence with a laugh that echoed against the glass walls. "Felicia, this is why I usually avoid hiring people straight from law school." He leaned back in his chair. "These aren't compliance issues. They're competitive advantages. We've created workarounds that let us move faster than traditional banks. But several of these practices violate banking regulations," I insisted, pointing to my carefully prepared slides. "Particularly the customer verification bypass on transactions under $1,000. Aaron finally looked up from his laptop. "Those regulations were written for a different era. We have better fraud detection algorithms than any regulator could dream of." Jackson stood up, signaling the meeting was over. He placed a hand on my shoulder as the others filed out. Listen, these are just new hire jitters. You'll understand our approach better once you've been here longer. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. We all want the same thing to protect our users. You just need to loosen up a bit on how we get there. As I watched them leave, the realization hit me. They had hired me to give the appearance of compliance, not to actually implement it. That night, I considered resigning. Instead, I made a decision that would define the next 8 years of my life. I started keeping receipts documenting every violation, every dismissed concern, and every regulatory risk. I didn't know then how critical this documentation would become. Building a compliance department at Tech Dynamics proved to be an uphill battle. Despite my title as head of compliance, I was allocated a budget that barely covered my own salary, let alone the team I needed to properly monitor a rapidly growing financial platform. 6 months in, I finally secured approval to hire one team member. Tara Williams was a former bank compliance officer, with a no-nonsense attitude that matched my own. The day she started, I closed my office door and laid out the reality of our situation. The company is growing faster than its compliance infrastructure, I explained, showing her my documentation of concerning practices. We need to establish proper controls before they hit the regulatory radar. Tara nodded grimly. Seen this before. Founders think rules are for traditional banks, not innovative startups. Together, we began implementing what controls we could while flagging more serious issues to leadership. 3 months into our partnership, Tara discovered something alarming. Customer funds were being temporarily used for operational expenses before being routed to their intended recipients. This is a serious violation, I explained to Jackson and Aaron during an emergency meeting I called. You can't use customer funds, even temporarily, for company operations. It's potentially criminal. Jackson looked annoyed at being pulled away from a product launch preparation. It's just a cash flow timing issue. The money always gets where it needs to go. That's not the point, I insisted. It violates basic financial separation requirements. If regulators found out, they could shut us down immediately. Aaron sighed dramatically. Fine, we'll adjust the system. Give us 2 weeks. 2 weeks turned into 2 months. When I followed up, Jackson assured me they were working on it. These things take time to implement without disrupting service. Trust the process, Felicia. I didn't trust the process. Instead, I began investigating our systems more deeply, eventually convincing a junior developer named Matt to give me greater visibility into the codebase. What I found horrified me. There were deliberate workarounds coded into the system functions, specifically designed to bypass compliance checks under certain conditions. I confronted Aaron with printouts of the code in question. You specifically coded exceptions to skip AML checks on transactions from certain high-volume customers. This isn't an oversight. It's deliberate. Aaron leaned back in his chair, unfazed. Those are for our enterprise clients. The checks slow down their operations. And they have their own compliance systems anyway. That's not how this works. We're still responsible. This is why technical people get frustrated with compliance, Aaron interrupted. You don't understand the technical necessities of running a platform at scale. These are optimizations, not violations. The law doesn't recognize optimizations as an exception, I countered. The law hasn't caught up to what we're building, he replied dismissively. Each confrontation followed the same pattern. My concerns would be acknowledged. Promises would be made. And nothing would change. Meanwhile, Tech Dynamics continued its meteoric rise. User numbers doubled, then tripled. Investment rounds brought in hundreds of millions in funding. Jackson became a fixture on business magazine covers and conference stages. Behind the scenes, I methodically documented everything. Each violation, each dismissed warning, each promised fix that never materialized, all carefully organized in encrypted files that only Tara and I could access. I wasn't sure what I would do with this information, but something told me to keep records of every transgression. 3 years into my tenure, During a routine system audit, I noticed unusual traffic patterns to an IP address not listed in our official infrastructure. Tracing the connection through various security layers, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Tech Dynamics was routing certain transactions through a server based in the Cayman Islands, completely outside U.S. regulatory jurisdiction. These weren't small transactions either. Millions of dollars were flowing through this hidden channel, bypassing all the compliance controls we had managed to implement on the main platform. This wasn't just bending the rules, it was potentially criminal behavior. I stared at my computer screen late that night, the evidence irrefutable before me. Tech Dynamics wasn't just moving fast and breaking things, they were deliberately circumventing U.S. banking laws, hiding money movements from regulators, and lying to me about their operations. The company that had once represented my professional dream had revealed itself to be my worst ethical nightmare. And I was the compliance officer, whose name would be on the documents if this all came crashing down. The weight of what I had discovered about Tech Dynamics began affecting every aspect of my life. Insomnia became my nightly companion. I would lie awake until 3 or 4 in the morning, my mind racing through potential scenarios, regulations being violated, and my own liability as the compliance officer of record. My boyfriend Mark noticed the change. "You look exhausted, Fel," he said over dinner at our favorite restaurant. "Is everything okay at work?" I wanted to tell him everything, to share the burden that was crushing me, but confidentiality prevented me from disclosing specifics. Instead, I gave him the sanitized version. Just the usual startup chaos, trying to implement proper processes while everyone focuses on growth. "Maybe it's time to look elsewhere," he suggested. "You've been unhappy there for months." He was right, but something kept me from sending out my resume. I had invested years building what little compliance infrastructure existed at Tech Dynamics. If I left, who would protect the customers? Whose money flowed through our systems? Who would keep pushing back against Jackson's disregard for regulations? My career trajectory had stalled as well. When the company created a new position for Senior Vice President of Risk and Compliance, I was the obvious choice, given my tenure and expertise. Instead, the role went to Tyler Scott, a former banker with half my technical knowledge but twice my talent for agreeing with Jackson in meetings. "We needed someone with traditional banking relationships for our next growth phase," Jackson explained when I confronted him about the decision. "Tyler brings connections we need. You're still valuable leading the day-to-day compliance operations." Translation: I was too much of a rule follower to be given real power. The isolation grew worse. Colleagues began avoiding me in the hallways. My invitation to team happy hours became less frequent. I had become the fun police, the person always pointing out problems instead of celebrating solutions. During a quarterly financial review, I questioned a series of transactions that had bypassed our monitoring systems. Daniel, the CFO, cut me off mid-sentence. "Felicia, with all due respect, I think you're being too emotional about these technical violations," he said, emphasizing the word emotional in a way that made several male executives exchange knowing glances. "There's nothing emotional about following banking regulations," I responded, keeping my voice level despite my anger. "These aren't technical violations, they're fundamental compliance failures." "Noted," Daniel replied dismissively. "Now, can we move on to actual business challenges?" That evening, I drafted my resignation letter. 4 years of fighting the same battles had left me exhausted and demoralized. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe it was time to take my skills somewhere they would be valued. I saved the letter but couldn't bring myself to send it. Quitting felt like abandoning the customers who trusted Tech Dynamics with their money, unaware of the corners being cut behind the scenes. A week later, I attended the annual Financial Technology Compliance Conference in Chicago. For the first time in months, I found myself among people who spoke my language and understood the importance of my role. During a networking lunch, I sat next to Grace Henderson, a former regulator who now worked for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN. Grace had a reputation for integrity and a no-nonsense approach to financial compliance. The problem with fintech, she said after we exchanged pleasantries, is that too many companies think innovation excuses them from following the rules that protect consumers. Exactly, I agreed, feeling a weight lift as I spoke to someone who understood. They act like regulations are arbitrary obstacles rather than necessary protections. Over coffee, Grace shared war stories from her regulatory days, including several companies that had faced severe penalties for the exact issues I was witnessing at Tech Dynamics. I was careful not to share specifics about my company, but her examples hit uncomfortably close to home. If you ever need to talk about hypothetical situations, Grace said as we exchanged business cards, my door is always open. Sometimes compliance professionals need a sounding board. The conference rekindled something in me, a sense of purpose and validation that what I was fighting for mattered. On the flight home, I called my father, a retired judge known for his unwavering ethical stance throughout his career. Dad, how did you handle cases when you knew the right decision would be unpopular? I remembered my oath, he said simply. Not to be popular, but to uphold the law. Why do you ask, sweetheart? I explained my situation in general terms, and his advice stayed with me. If you're at the table, you have a chance to make things better. Once you walk away, you lose that chance forever. With renewed determination, I decided to make one more concentrated effort to fix the compliance issues from within. I would document everything even more meticulously, build internal alliances, and present such an irrefutable case that even Jackson couldn't ignore it. My new resolve lasted exactly 3 days. When I returned to the office and tried to access our transaction monitoring system, my credentials were denied. After calling IT support, I received a bland explanation. Some systems are undergoing security upgrades. Your access will be limited temporarily for security purposes. I knew immediately what was happening. They were cutting me off from the evidence. The question was, why now? Being partially locked out of Tech Dynamics systems only strengthened my determination. If they were trying to hide something from me specifically, it had to be significant. I spent the next few weeks building backdoor access to critical monitoring systems, leveraging relationships with developers who didn't fully understand the implications of what they were helping me see. Matt, the junior developer who had helped me before, created a script that automatically flagged unusual transaction patterns without requiring direct system access. It's just a learning project for me, he said nervously. I'm interested in anomaly detection algorithms. We both knew it was more than that, but maintaining plausible deniability protected him. Through these covert methods, I discovered the full extent of the offshore operations. The Cayman Islands server wasn't just processing a few edge cases, it had become a parallel system handling transactions that would raise regulatory red flags if processed through normal channels. Hundreds of millions of dollars flowed through this shadow infrastructure annually, completely invisible to the compliance systems I had built. The most disturbing discovery was the client list for these transactions. While most of Tech Dynamics' public-facing business served legitimate companies and individuals, the offshore system catered to businesses in high-risk categories, online gambling operations, certain cryptocurrency exchanges known for minimal verification processes, and companies based in countries with weak money laundering controls. This wasn't just regulatory corner-cutting anymore. This was potentially facilitating money laundering on a massive scale. Armed with undeniable evidence, I took an unprecedented step. I bypassed the executive team entirely and wrote a formal report addressed directly to the board of directors. 26 pages of meticulously documented violations, complete with transaction records, system logs, and relevant regulatory citations. I sent it via certified mail to each board member's personal address to ensure it couldn't be intercepted. 3 days later, I was invited to present my findings at an emergency board meeting. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. Surely the board, with their fiduciary responsibilities and personal liability, would take action. The boardroom was tense when I arrived. Jackson sat stone-faced at the head of the table, while board members reviewed my materials with serious expressions. I presented my findings clearly, emphasizing both the legal risks and potential penalties. Howard Jenkins, the lead director, thanked me for my diligence. This is precisely why compliance functions are critical to organizations like ours. We take these allegations extremely seriously and will conduct a full, independent investigation. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that change would finally come. 2 weeks passed with no communication about the investigation. Then a company-wide email announced that Tech Dynamics had hired an independent compliance consultant to review our processes as part of our commitment to regulatory excellence. The consultant, I soon discovered, was from a firm with close ties to our lead investor. A month later, the board shared the investigation findings with me. While there were procedural improvements to be made, they had found no evidence of systematic compliance failures or deliberate regulatory evasion. The offshore system was characterized as a technical optimization for international transactions that would be gradually integrated into standard compliance protocols. It was corporate gaslighting at its finest. My concrete evidence had been reinterpreted, minimized, and ultimately dismissed. The message was clear. The growth story was too valuable to be derailed by compliance concerns. Meanwhile, Tech Dynamics continued its meteoric rise in the financial technology world. A new funding round valued the company at $4 billion. Jackson appeared on the cover of Business Insider as a financial revolutionary, while tech publications praised the company's innovative approach to removing friction from global money movement. Plans for an initial public offering were underway, with investment banks competing for the lucrative role of leading the offering. The IPO would make the executives and early investors extraordinarily wealthy. Jackson's stake alone would be worth hundreds of millions. The public Jackson Mercer bore little resemblance to the one I knew behind closed doors. In media interviews, he spoke passionately about responsible disruption and building trust through technology. He positioned Tech Dynamics as the ethical alternative to traditional banking, even as he continued to undermine the very compliance systems that would make that claim true. As IPO preparations intensified, I found an unexpected ally in Stephanie, the COO. During a late evening, when we were both working in an otherwise empty office, she stopped by my desk. "The offshore system is worse than you know," she said quietly, closing my office door. "Jackson and Aaron have been expanding it significantly in the last few months." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, suspicious of her sudden candor after years of silent complicity. "Because the IPO changes things. We'll be making statements to regulators and investors that I know are false." She looked genuinely troubled. "I've gone along with a lot, justifying it as necessary for growth, but this crosses a line I'm not comfortable with." "Why not speak up? You have more influence than I do." Stephanie's expression darkened. "Jackson has leverage over everyone in leadership. For me," she paused, weighing her words, "let's just say there are personal indiscretions he's helped keep quiet. He reminds me occasionally, in case I forget." This revelation cast the company's toxic culture in an even more sinister light. It wasn't just about growth at all costs. It was about power and control. After Stephanie left, I returned to my documentation project with renewed purpose. If Tech Dynamics went public based on misrepresentations, thousands of innocent investors would be harmed when the truth eventually emerged. The question was no longer if the compliance failures would be exposed, but when and how much damage would be done before that happened. That night, I discovered something that confirmed my worst fears. The legal team had been editing my detailed compliance reports before they were filed with regulators, systematically removing the most serious findings while keeping enough minor issues to appear thorough and transparent. The documents filed under my name no longer reflected my actual assessments. They had made me an unwilling accomplice to their fraud. As Tech Dynamics accelerated toward its IPO, the pressure within the company became unbearable. Investment bankers swarmed our offices daily, conducting due diligence that somehow never uncovered the compliance issues hiding in plain sight. Lawyers drafted prospectus documents that painted a picture of the company so divorced from reality that I could barely recognize the place where I'd spent the last 7 years. My sleep had deteriorated to the point where 3 hours counted as a good night. Mark and I had broken up, largely because I couldn't share what was consuming me, and he couldn't understand why I stayed at a job that was clearly destroying my well-being. "You're choosing that company over everything else," he said the night he moved out. "I can't compete with whatever hold it has on you." He wasn't wrong. I had become obsessed with documenting the truth, as if the perfect compilation of evidence would somehow magically fix everything. But each revelation only deepened the rabbit hole. The offshore server operation had expanded dramatically, now handling transactions that had even clearer connections to potential money laundering. Using Matt's monitoring script, I identified payments flowing through our system from entities on international watch lists for financial crimes. The kind of red flags that should immediately trigger regulatory reporting. I scheduled an urgent meeting with Aaron to present these findings. He kept me waiting for 45 minutes before finally appearing in the conference room. Clearly annoyed. "This better be important. I'm preparing for the technical deep dive with Goldman next week." I placed the transaction records on the table. These entities are on watch lists for suspected connections to money laundering. Their transactions are being routed through our offshore system, specifically to avoid triggering alerts. Aaron barely glanced at the documents. "Those lists are notoriously over-inclusive. We use more sophisticated risk assessment tools." "That's not your decision to make," I insisted. "We have a legal obligation to report these transactions to FinCEN." His expression hardened. "File that report, and you won't just lose your job, you'll never work in fintech again." "Jackson will make sure of it." The threat was explicit, but it clarified something for me. "So you admit these transactions should be reported?" "I admit nothing. I'm telling you to be a team player during the most important moment in this company's history." He stood up. "We're about to create enormous value for everyone who's been part of this journey. Don't be the person who tries to derail that over some technical compliance issues." After he left, I sat alone in the conference room, his threat echoing in my mind. For the first time, I seriously considered becoming a whistleblower. I could take my documentation to regulators and let them investigate, but the potential consequences were severe, not just for me, but for everyone connected to Tech Dynamics. Hundreds of innocent employees who knew nothing about the compliance issues would lose their jobs. Customers would panic about the safety of their funds. The broader fintech industry, which did include many legitimate innovators, would face increased scrutiny and regulatory backlash. I needed advice from someone I could trust. I arranged to meet Stephanie for coffee on a Saturday morning, away from the office and its potential for surveillance. "I'm considering going to regulators," I told her directly. "The situation is worse than even you know." Stephanie looked unsurprised but troubled. "I've suspected as much. The engineers working on the offshore system are kept completely separate from the rest of the tech team. Even I don't have full visibility. You said Jackson has leverage over you. Does he have it over others too?" She nodded slowly. "Aaron was involved in a sexual harassment cover-up at his previous company. Jackson helped bury it. Daniel has some creative accounting in his past that would interest the SEC. Jackson collects these vulnerabilities like insurance policies." "And what about you? Would you corroborate my account if I went to regulators?" Stephanie looked away. "I have a daughter in college and aging parents who depend on me. The stock options from the IPO would secure their future." She met my eyes again. "I'm not proud of this position, but I can't be your ally publicly. I'm sorry." I understood her dilemma all too well. Everyone had their reasons for looking the other way. What made my moral clarity more valuable than their practical concerns? I decided to make one final attempt to resolve this internally. I requested a private meeting with Jackson, prepared to lay all my cards on the table. To my surprise, he agreed immediately. In his corner office with its panoramic view of the city, I presented the most damning evidence I had collected, not just policy violations but clear evidence of criminal conduct, transactions linked to sanctioned entities, deliberate circumvention of anti-money laundering controls. and the systematic concealment of these activities from regulators. This isn't about compliance philosophy anymore, I concluded. This is about criminal liability. When this comes out, not if, but when people will go to prison. Jackson listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he was silent for nearly a minute. You know, Felicia, I've always respected your dedication, he finally said. It's misguided, but sincere. That's rare. This isn't about me. It's about the law. Laws evolve. They always lag behind innovation. He stood and walked to the window. Do you know how many regulations were written for a world that no longer exists? We're creating the future of finance. Sometimes that means the rules need to catch up to us, not the other way around. Financial crimes aren't innovation, I countered. Money laundering harms real people. He turned back to me. I'll make you a deal. After the IPO, we'll create a special compliance task force with real authority. You'll lead it. We'll address these issues properly, but in a controlled way that doesn't destroy everything we've built. The offer was tempting the influence I'd been seeking for years. Promised at last. But I'd heard versions of this promise before. I need more than words this time, I said. I need immediate action on the offshore system and full disclosure to regulators. Jackson's facade of reasonableness vanished. That's not going to happen. The IPO is moving forward. Be realistic about your options here. The following Tuesday, Jackson called an all-hands meeting to discuss the IPO timeline. The entire company gathered in our largest meeting space. Excitement palpable in the air. For many employees, the public offering represented life-changing financial rewards after years of startup salaries and long hours. Jackson was in his element, charismatic and visionary, as he outlined the company's journey and promising future. We've revolutionized financial technology by challenging outdated models and removing unnecessary friction, he declared to enthusiastic applause. When he opened the floor for questions, I felt an irresistible compulsion to speak up. This wasn't planned. I'd intended to remain quiet, but hearing him present this sanitized version of our company to people who deserved the truth felt unbearable. I raised my hand, and Jackson, perhaps not expecting me to speak in this forum, called on me. You've mentioned our commitment to compliance several times, I said, standing so everyone could see me. But our offshore processing system operates outside regulatory oversight, handling transactions that would raise red flags under normal compliance protocols. Shouldn't we address these issues before taking investor money? The room fell completely silent. Jackson's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. Felicia, I appreciate your diligence, it's why we hired you, he responded smoothly. We've had the offshore system reviewed by outside counsel, who confirmed it meets all legal requirements. But this is hardly the forum for technical compliance discussions. It's not a technical issue when we're processing transactions linked to money laundering, I persisted. These are fundamental legal violations that expose the company to severe penalties. Jackson's smile disappeared entirely. He walked toward me, speaking in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Sweetheart, stick to the paperwork. Let the men handle business. The dismissive words hung in the air, as several male executives chuckled. We have an IPO to focus on. Your concerns have been noted and dismissed repeatedly by people who understand our business model better than you do. The room remained silent, with employees suddenly finding their shoes or phones fascinating. Not a single person made eye contact with me as I stood there, publicly humiliated by the CEO in front of the entire company. In that moment, something shifted inside me. The weight of 8 years of warnings, documentation, and futile internal advocacy crystallized into perfect clarity. I had tried everything possible to fix the problems from within. I had given Tech Dynamics every opportunity to do the right thing. They had made their choice. Now I would make mine. I returned to my office with an unexpected sense of calm. Where I had felt conflict and anxiety for years, I now experienced absolute certainty. The public humiliation had freed me from any lingering loyalty to Tech Dynamics or its leadership. My computer contained encrypted backups of all the evidence I'd gathered over 8 years. System logs showing the deliberate routing of suspicious transactions through the offshore server. Emails where executives dismissed compliance concerns, documentation of the edited regulatory filings, and transaction records linked to entities on international watch lists. I had been preparing this documentation as a shield protection against being scapegoated if regulators ever discovered the violations. Now, it would serve a different purpose. I copied the files onto an encrypted drive and deleted all traces from my company computer. Years of working in compliance had taught me to be careful about digital footprints. I gathered my personal items, family photos, law school diploma, the few mementos worth keeping, and placed them in my bag. Looking around the office where I had spent countless hours fighting for principles that the company leadership never truly valued, I felt nothing but relief at the prospect of never returning. Once home, I pulled out the business card Grace Henderson had given me months earlier at the compliance conference. As a FinCEN investigator, she was exactly the right person to receive this information. I called the number listed. "Grace Henderson," she answered crisply. "This is Felicia Williams from Tech Dynamics," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "We met at the Financial Technology Compliance Conference. You said to call if I ever needed a sounding board for hypothetical situations." "I remember you," she replied, "but I suspect this isn't hypothetical anymore." "No," I confirmed. "It's very real. Tech Dynamics has been operating a parallel transaction processing system through an offshore server specifically to circumvent regulatory requirements. I have comprehensive documentation of multiple violations, including transactions linked to entities on money laundering watch lists." Grace was silent for a moment. "Are you aware that you're making a formal whistleblower disclosure?" "Completely aware. And you understand the potential consequences?" "I do. I'll need to bring in colleagues from various agencies. Can you meet today?" 2 hours later, I sat in a downtown federal building conference room with Grace and 3 colleagues: an FBI agent specializing in financial crimes, an SEC investigator, and a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office. For 3 hours, I walked them through the evidence, explaining the technical details and regulatory implications of what Tech Dynamics had been doing. "The offshore server contains the most damning evidence," I explained. "It processes transactions that would trigger regulatory alerts if they went through the main system. They've gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it isolated and deniable." "When did this system come online?" the FBI agent asked. "About 4 years ago, but it's expanded significantly in the last 18 months as they've prepared for the IPO. They've been particularly active in the last few weeks, processing higher-risk transactions before the regulatory scrutiny that comes with going public." "And you're confident the executive team knew about this?" the prosecutor asked. "Jackson Mercer and Aaron Wells designed it specifically to avoid regulatory oversight. Daniel Brooks structured the financial reporting to conceal its existence. I've documented meetings where I explicitly warned them about the legal implications, and emails where they acknowledged the risks but proceeded anyway. The SEC investigator reviewed my documentation with increasing interest. This is remarkably thorough. The timing is significant too. They're about to file their S-1 registration statement for the IPO. If they've misrepresented their compliance posture to investors." "They absolutely have," I confirmed. "The draft prospectus claims they maintain industry-leading compliance protocols across all operations." "That's demonstrably false." By the end of the meeting, the gravity of what I'd revealed was evident in their expressions. This wasn't a case of technical violations or regulatory gray areas. This was systematic fraud and potential criminal conduct. "We'll need to move quickly," Grace said, "especially if they're accelerating high-risk transactions ahead of the IPO." "What happens next?" I asked. "We'll secure warrants based on your evidence. Given the flight risk for digital evidence, we'll likely execute them within 48 hours. She paused. "Until then, it's critical that you maintain normal behavior. If they suspect you've come to us, they might destroy evidence." "There's an executive meeting tomorrow afternoon to discuss final IPO preparations," I said. All the key players will be there. The FBI agent nodded. That would be an optimal time for us to execute the warrants. As I left the federal building, I felt lighter than I had in years. The burden I'd carried alone for so long was now in the hands of people with the authority to act. Whatever came next, career repercussions, potential retaliation, the inevitable legal battles would be worth it to finally see justice done. The next morning, I arrived at the office at my usual time, greeted colleagues with my usual reserve, and proceeded with my usual tasks. No one who observed me would have suspected that in a few hours, federal agents would descend on Tech Dynamics. At 2 in the afternoon, Jackson's executive assistant sent a calendar reminder for the IPO preparation meeting at 3. I acknowledged it and continued reviewing compliance reports. Reports I knew contained sanitized versions of the truth, edited to conceal the very violations I had disclosed to authorities. At 2:55, I gathered my notebook and pen and headed to the executive conference room. Jackson, Aaron, and Daniel were already there, along with representatives from the investment bank leading our IPO and outside counsel specializing in securities law. Stephanie arrived moments after me, our eyes meeting briefly with an unspoken understanding. The meeting had barely begun when Jackson's assistant interrupted, looking flustered. "There are federal agents in the lobby with a warrant. They're insisting on speaking with you immediately." The room erupted in confusion. The lawyers demanded to see the warrants. The bankers exchanged alarmed glances, and Jackson looked genuinely shocked, an expression I had rarely seen on his perpetually confident face. "What agency? What are they looking for?" he demanded. His assistant looked even more uncomfortable. "Multiple agencies. FBI, SEC, and others. They have warrants for financial records, server access, and..." She glanced at a note in her hand. "Specific offshore infrastructure." The blood drained from Jackson's face. Aaron's eyes widened in panic. They knew exactly what this meant. The federal agents entered efficiently, presenting warrants and immediately securing the executive floor. Technical specialists headed straight for the IT department with specific instructions to secure the offshore server connections. Other agents began collecting devices and documents from executive offices. I remained in the conference room, watching the proceedings with a calm that clearly unnerved Jackson. As the realization dawned on him, his shock transformed into fury. "It was you," he said, his voice low but intense. "You did this." I met his gaze steadily. "I warned you for 8 years. You chose not to listen. We'll fight this. We have the best lawyers money can buy." "Money laundering isn't a regulatory technicality you can lawyer your way out of," I replied. "And I kept copies of all the compliance reports before your legal team edited out the serious violations, the ones filed with regulators under my name but altered without my knowledge." His face registered genuine surprise. "You couldn't have known about that." "I've known about it for months. Just like I've known about every other lie, every workaround, every deliberate violation. Did you really think I wouldn't notice when my own reports were changed?" Before he could respond, an FBI agent approached Jackson. "Mr. Mercer, we need you to come with us for questioning." As they led him away, Jackson looked back at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. In that moment, I realized that despite all my warnings, he had never truly believed there would be consequences. He had become so accustomed to bending reality to his will that the concept of accountability seemed foreign to him. I remained in the conference room as federal agents continued their work throughout the building. Technical teams secured servers and workstations. Financial crime specialists boxed up documents from the accounting department. The carefully constructed facade of Tech Dynamics as an innovative, rule-following disruptor was being dismantled before my eyes. Grace Henderson found me there an hour later. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "This is one of the most significant financial crime cases I've seen in years." "What happens to the company?" I asked. "There are hundreds of employees who had nothing to do with any of this." "That will depend on the extent of the violations and how cooperative the company is going forward. But, from what we've already found on the offshore server, She shook her head. This is exactly what we suspected based on your disclosure. As I gathered my things to leave, a junior developer stopped me in the hallway, confusion evident on his face. What's happening? Why are there federal agents everywhere? The truth is finally coming out, I said simply. Walking out of Tech Dynamics for the last time, I passed Jackson in the lobby, sitting ashen-faced as a federal agent read him his rights. Our eyes met briefly across the room. I gave him a small, knowing smile, the same one from the beginning of this story. The reckoning had indeed come. The events at Tech Dynamics dominated financial news for weeks. Fintech darling faces federal investigation blared the Wall Street Journal headline the next morning. CNBC ran special segments on the dark side of financial disruption. Tech publications that had once celebrated Jackson as a visionary now scrutinized his fall with equal enthusiasm. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Trading in Tech Dynamics' private shares on secondary markets was suspended. The IPO was indefinitely postponed. Employees gathered in stunned groups throughout the office, trying to make sense of what had happened to their once promising company. I spent the following days cooperating fully with investigators, walking them through years of documentation and explaining the technical intricacies of how the offshore system had been designed to evade regulatory oversight. My meticulous record-keeping proved invaluable to building the government's case. Your documentation is extraordinary, the lead FBI investigator told me. Most whistleblowers bring allegations. You brought us a complete roadmap. The extent of the violations exceeded even my understanding. The offshore server had processed over $3 billion in transactions linked to entities with known connections to money laundering operations. Email records revealed that Jackson and Aaron had specifically designed the system to capture high-fee transactions that legitimate processors would reject. 2 weeks after the raid, criminal charges were filed against Jackson, Aaron, and Daniel. Fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to violate banking regulations, securities fraud, and obstruction of justice. The charges carried potential sentences of decades in federal prison. Stephanie was offered a cooperation agreement in exchange for her testimony. She had been less directly involved in the criminal aspects of the operation and had occasionally tried to push back, albeit ineffectively. Her text message to me the day after the raid was simple. You were braver than the rest of us. Thank you. The company itself faced an uncertain future. The board of directors, now facing their own potential liability for inadequate oversight, moved quickly to install crisis management. They fired the remaining executives who had been implicated and brought in a respected former federal regulator as interim CEO. To my surprise, I received a call from Howard Jenkins, the lead director who had previously helped bury my concerns. The board would like to meet with you, he said, his tone markedly different from our previous interactions. We're trying to understand how to salvage what's left of the company. I agreed to the meeting, curious about what they could possibly want from me now. In the boardroom where I had once been patronized and dismissed, I now faced a subdued group of directors grappling with the consequences of their inaction. We failed in our oversight, Howard admitted bluntly. We accepted assurances we should have questioned. Now we're trying to determine if there's a viable path forward for Tech Dynamics. Why are you telling me this? Because we want you to help us fix it. He leaned forward. The technology still has value. The majority of our operations were legitimate. With proper compliance systems and new leadership, there could be a future for the company and its employees. I stared at him incredulously. You want me to come back? After everything that happened? As Chief Compliance Officer with expanded authority and a direct reporting line to the board. Complete autonomy to build proper systems. A seat on the executive committee. He slid a document across the table. The terms are all here. I left the meeting without giving an answer, needing time to process this unexpected turn of events. My first instinct was to refuse. Outright. Why return to the company that had ignored and belittled me for 8 years? That evening, I received dozens of messages from Tech Dynamics employees, developers, customer service representatives, marketing specialists, people I had barely interacted with during my time there. Their words carried similar themes: shock at what had been happening behind the scenes, gratitude for my actions, and hope that the company might survive in some form. Most of us had no idea what the executives were doing, wrote a product manager I'd worked with occasionally. We believed in the mission of making financial services more accessible. That part wasn't a lie. These messages forced me to confront a complicated truth. While the leadership had been corrupt, many employees had genuinely believed in the company's stated mission. They had built technologies and services that, stripped of the fraudulent elements, could provide real value. After 2 weeks of careful consideration and consultation with both my father and Grace Henderson at FinCEN, I made my decision. I would return to Tech Dynamics, but on my terms. I negotiated an even stronger position than initially offered. Executive Vice President of Risk and Compliance with final authority over all transaction processing systems, a seat on the board of directors, and a mandate to rebuild the company's compliance infrastructure from the ground up. "You're certain about this?" my father asked when I told him my decision. "After everything they put you through?" "I'm not doing it for them," I explained. "I'm doing it for the employees who were betrayed by leadership. And honestly, for myself too. I spent 8 years trying to make that place function properly. Now I finally have the chance to do it right." The rebuilding process was neither quick nor easy. My first act was to permanently decommission the offshore system and implement proper monitoring across all transaction channels. I hired a team of respected compliance professionals, giving them the resources and authority I had been denied for years. We worked closely with regulators to address past violations and establish robust safeguards against future ones. The company paid substantial fines and accepted stringent oversight as part of settlement agreements with multiple agencies. It was a painful but necessary cleansing. 6 months into the transformation, a technology journal requested an interview about the company's path to redemption. With the board's blessing, I agreed. Tech Dynamics became the poster child for compliance failures in fintech, the journalist noted. "How do you build trust after that kind of damage?" "By recognizing that compliance isn't an obstacle to innovation, it's a prerequisite," I replied. Financial technology only creates real value when it operates within frameworks that protect consumers and the integrity of the financial system. The interview led to speaking invitations at industry conferences, the same events where I had once felt like a compliance outsider. Now, audience members took careful notes as I discussed the importance of ethical leadership and structural safeguards in financial technology. A year after the federal raid, I received an unexpected visitor. The federal prosecutor, who had handled the case against Jackson and the other executives, requested a meeting. "The sentencing hearings are next month," she explained in my office. "Jackson's lawyers have requested that you meet with him. He wants to talk before he goes to prison." My immediate instinct was to refuse. What could Jackson possibly say that would matter now? "He's facing 15 years, the prosecutor added. "The judge might consider cooperation and genuine remorse as mitigating factors at sentencing." Eventually, I agreed to the meeting not for Jackson's benefit, but for the closure it might provide me. We met in a conference room at the prosecutor's office, a neutral location where Jackson, now out on bail pending sentencing, appeared strikingly different from the confident CEO I had known. The expensive suits and practiced charm had given way to a subdued man visibly grappling with his new reality. "Thank you for coming," he said as I took a seat across from him. "I didn't think you would." "Neither did I admitted. "Why did you want to see me?" "To tell you that you were right." He looked directly at me, perhaps for the first time without calculation or manipulation in his gaze. "About everything. The compliance issues, the risks, the fundamental wrongness of what we were doing." He paused. "I convinced myself that rules were for people who lacked vision, that our growth justified any means necessary." "It took federal charges for you to realize that was wrong?" "It took losing everything," he corrected. "The company, my reputation, my freedom." He shook his head slowly. I had every opportunity to listen to you. You warned me for years, and I not only ignored you, I undermined and humiliated you. The acknowledgement was unexpected. I had anticipated excuses, perhaps blame, but not this admission. The board tells me you're rebuilding the company, he continued. Doing it the right way. We're trying. For what it's worth, I'm glad. The technology itself was always valuable. It was how we implemented it that was corrupt. He hesitated. I know this doesn't change anything, but I am sorry. For all of it. As I left the meeting, I felt the final weight of Tech Dynamics' corrupt past lifting from my shoulders. Jackson's apology didn't erase the years of struggle and dismissal, but it provided something I hadn't realized I needed. Validation that my fight had been necessary and just. 2 years after the federal raid, Tech Dynamics emerged from its restructuring as a smaller but more sustainable company. Our compliance systems became industry benchmarks, and regulators occasionally consulted us on best practices for fintech oversight. The irony wasn't lost on me. The company once known for its compliance failures was now helping shape compliance standards. On the anniversary of my return to the company, I launched a mentorship program for women in financial compliance and technology ethics. Our first cohort included 20 young professionals determined to ensure that legal and ethical considerations were central to financial innovation, not afterthoughts. The hardest part of compliance isn't understanding the regulations, I told them at our opening session. It's having the courage to stand up for them when facing pressure to compromise. Your technical knowledge matters, but your integrity matters more. Looking at their eager faces, I saw echoes of myself from a decade earlier before the battles, before the vindication. But unlike my younger self, these women wouldn't stand alone. They would have mentors, networks, and the cautionary tale of Tech Dynamics to guide them. In the end, the most valuable lesson from my 8 years fighting for compliance wasn't about financial regulations or corporate governance. It was about the power of persistence, the determination to stand firm when it would be easier to give in. Sometimes being right isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be right, repeatedly, in the face of dismissal and hostility, until the truth finally breaks through. My name is Felicia Williams. I spent 8 years warning a company about its compliance failures before finally taking action that brought it to justice. If you find yourself fighting a similar battle for what's right, remember, your voice matters. Your persistence matters. And sometimes the reckoning takes time, but it does come. Have you ever stood up for what was right when it would have been easier to stay silent? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might need encouragement to keep fighting their own battles for truth and accountability. Thank you for listening. And remember, integrity isn't measured when it's easy, but when it's hardest to maintain.